The Institute.
Institute for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Hello, and welcome to Short Circuit, your podcast on the federal courts of appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Tuesday, July 27th, 2021. We have a special Short Circuit today with some special guests, and I'm very excited that I'll be introducing them to you in a moment. First, though, I wanted to put our listeners radar a conference that the Center for Judicial Engagement is sponsoring, along with our friends at the Liberty and Law Center at George Mason University. The conference is entitled, Does the Will of the People Actually Exist? Judicial Deference to Whom? It's all about this thing called the will of the people and what it actually is, and what that has to say for how we perceive judicial review. A philosopher might say what we're doing is trying to answer the question of what is the metaphysical reality of the will of the people. We'll have more to say about it in subsequent podcasts, but for now, you can find the link in the conference webpage in the show notes, and you can sign up to attend in person if you're in the DC area or online. It will be held Friday, September 10th, 2021, and there will be various top scholars from law, political science, and economics, plus a free lunch. We'd love to see you there, and if you do come, feel free to run up to me and tell me how much you love Short Circuit. One reason you might love Short Circuit is because we don't always talk about the federal courts of appeals. Some days we venture into other areas of law, and today is one of those days. Now, a few months ago, we had a special about an area of law, marriage equality, spread across various state constitutions. Today, we're taking the opposite approach, and we'll be talking about a particular state and its own particular constitution. And what better state than the biggest of them all, the Golden State of California? I'm very honored to introduce to you two gentlemen whose enthusiasm for state constitutions rivals my own. We're going to talk to them about all things to do with the California Constitution, especially its history and the study of it. And we'll also talk about how we access historical records in our age of digitization and important work they've been doing to make California's past more accessible. They are Dr. David Carrillo and Steve Duvernay. David is a lecturer in residence at the University of California at Berkeley and the executive director of its California Constitution Center. The center, which we'll hear a lot about today, is devoted to developing scholarship concerning the California Constitution and the California Supreme Court. David, among other achievements, has published numerous articles on California constitutional law and served with a host of legal organizations. Steve is an attorney with Benbrook Law Group in Sacramento, California, where he specializes in constitutional litigation in state and federal courts, among other areas. He is a lecturer at the University of California and a senior research fellow with the California Constitution Center. He has written extensively on constitutional law, including the Californian variety. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to both of you. And let's start off with what you do at the California Constitution Center, and then we can move on to some background about the history of the state and its constitutions.
So the California Constitution Center, we've been around for almost 10 years, and we started out of a perceived void or a need for some kind of focused academic study on the California Constitution and the judicial branch, in particular the state's highest court, the California Supreme Court. State constitutions tend to not be well studied, or at least consistently studied. There are a few huge exceptions. Professor Robert Williams, formerly of Rutgers, he recently retired. He and his colleague Alan Tarr studied state constitutions in general, the 50 state constitutions, and in particular the state constitution of New Jersey for around 30 years. So when I say that they tend to not be well studied, I mean that mainly in comparison with the federal Constitution, which is extensively studied.
Right.
But there are a few major exceptions, like Bob Williams and his center. So my center is frankly modeled somewhat on his. The biggest difference is that one of his main focuses was on subnational constitutionalism, as he calls it, the study of all 50 constitutions of the states. We do a little bit of that, but our focus is more 80 or 90% focused on California's. We do a little bit of comparative work, but we try to focus on California.
Right. And what are some of the projects that you've manifested that in? It seems like in addition to just having a conference or writing a few things, you guys really get into the nitty-gritty of some of this history.
Yeah, we try to look at it in terms of tranches of activity, hitting different audiences in different ways. So one way to reach a particular audience is the legal community. Doing a bench bar conference. So we have a few regular conferences that we've done that tend to bring in either practitioners in general or practitioners in a particular subject matter expertise. Municipal finance or local government lawyers. So we try to reach practitioners through events like that. We've done a few academic conferences. We've done some international things for, I mentioned we do a little bit of comparative work. California, for example, is famous for its direct democracy provisions. So occasionally, we've done a little bit of work for governments of other countries that have wondered, I wonder if we should adopt that too. And we provide them with some cautionary tales.
I was going to ask, is it a recommendation or a caution?
So far, no one has said, yeah, we should do that, which I think is telling. So we try to reach particular audiences, practitioners through conferences. We teach courses to reach students. We write articles to theoretically reach the judiciary and hopefully, influence some minds and move the needle there. We recently published the first ever casebook on the California Constitution, both as a teaching tool for our classes that we teach, and then we also wrote it in kind of a Chemerinsky treatise style. So it's actually useful to practitioners as a study guide or a reference work for the California Constitution.
And Steve, I understand you litigate at times under the California Constitution. Do you want to share any insights from your work there?
Sure. We do a variety of work in state constitutional law, which can range from advising, say, political candidates on free speech and constitutional election issues when we talk about the recall, for example, or the initiative power, which frequently comes up in election-related litigation. In addition, we do a fair amount of practice on state privacy rights and state taxation law, as I'm sure we'll discuss in detail when talking about the comparative structure of the federal and state constitutions. The California Constitution, for example, gets into pretty significant detail on how taxes can be assessed against people, how they're approved, and the processes that must be followed. So there's a fair amount of litigation in that area of law in particular that we get involved in with some regularity.
Yeah, and the work that Steve does is it exemplifies one of the mantras that we have at the center, which is that we want our work to be of practical value. So even if we're doing something that's sort of typically academic, like writing a law review article, we always try to bring it back to reality and think about how will this move the needle or influence hearts and minds or potentially change outcomes in the real world, like in the litigation that Steve does.
Right. And I understand one part of that is your work on the California Supreme Court specifically. Is
right.
That right?
Right. So I mentioned tranches of activities, and one of the things we do is what I would broadly call mass media or public facing writing. And that largely takes a couple of different forms. One is we do short form things with the Recorder or the National Law Journal. In California, the legal newspaper is called the Daily Journal. It's published out of San Francisco and Los Angeles. And we've written for a couple of other, what you would think of as sort of like the legal newspapers, sort of like the San Francisco Chronicle or the New York Times, but specifically of the legal world.
Right.
So 1,000-word op-ed think pieces that are specifically aimed at reaching a sort of a broader public legal audience. And then the other part of that we do is, and again, I try to steal from the best. So I modeled the blog that we produce at the center on SCOTUS blog. We called it SCOCA blog because we focus on the California Supreme Court, not the Supreme Court of the United States. And SCOCA blog, it's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from the more public legal media things. So the Recorder has a subscribership that's in the tens of thousands. It's a nationwide publication. The Daily Journal in California the subscriber list, I'm sure, is in the thousands. Skokoblog, our actual subscribers, it's very small, but we tend to be okay with that because we like to think of it as it's small, but it's the eyeballs that matter. We don't necessarily need everybody to be reading it as long as the right people read it. And it's a way for us to hopefully reach what we think of as our target audience, which is people who can litigate the cases and make the decisions that actually change the law on the California Constitution.
So on the California Constitution, I think most people have this general sense that at one time California was a pretty sleepy place. Gold was discovered. A lot of people went there. They kind of came up with their own state and laws. And, it's been moving in bigger and bigger directions ever since. So fill in some of the details for those of us who don't know much beyond that. I understand, California, like a lot of states, hasn't just had one constitution. It's actually had two. It's met twice to try to write those constitutions, and of course, it's amended it in famously, as you alluded to earlier, many times since then. So, if you could take it back to the beginning and tell us where California's constitutionalism came from.
I really liked your 25 words or less summary of California history. That was very accurate. It's everything you need to know about California. So yeah, California was kind of a nothing, not important place until gold was discovered, and then everything changed, and nothing's been the same since. So the thing that I would want to get across about the constitutional evolution of California is that it's highly context dependent. As you mentioned, California, like most other states, has had more than one constitutional convention. So one of the comparative points that we tried to repeat frequently in our work is that most of the things that people know about the U.S. Constitution either aren't true or the opposite of them is true for state constitutions. So the U.S. Constitution tends to be very static. State constitutions tend to be very dynamic. There's only been one U.S. Constitution. Let's leave aside the Articles of Confederation for the moment. There's only been one convention. There's only been one constitution. States have had literally hundreds of constitutions and conventions. So constitutional dynamism is sort of the rule within the states. Constitutional stasis, except for judicial interpretation, tends to be the rule in the United States. When's the last time we amended the U.S. Constitution? Not within my lifetime.
So the 27th Amendment, but we'll leave that out of it.
That was the one with the guy with the college paper, right?
That's right, and it capped. It was originally part of the Bill of Rights. It capped salaries in the current Congress.
Yeah. So California's had two constitutional conventions, two constitutions. The first convention was in 1849. The second convention started in 1878 and continued into the next year. So our first constitution was adopted in 1849. Our second constitution was adopted in 1879. And then there's a later evolution that I'm sure we'll come back and talk about later. But in all three of those contexts, the later evolution and the two constitutional conventions, they're all sort of the product of their environment. Context is key for understanding them. So you mentioned the gold rush, and that obviously was the context for the 1849 Constitution. And it sort of everything around, or everything that was important to the delegates to that convention arose in that context. It was a very new, dynamic culture or society that was evolving very quickly. There kind of were no rules. The miners made up things as they went. And some of the rules that they made up they still exist in water law today in California. So everything was very contextual. It was fast. The convention only lasted 6 weeks. It wasn't particularly original. They borrowed a lot from other constitutions, Iowa and New York in particular.
Do you know why those in particular, by the way? Did they just happen to have a copy of each?
It's sort of funny. One of the delegates to the convention showed up with a stack of the Iowa Constitution and just handed it out. And And when somebody said, "Why are you giving these out?" He says, "Well, it's one of the latest and the shortest, the most recent and the shortest. So let's use this." And the other delegates were like, "All right, that sounds good." A lot of them were from the East Coast, so they were very familiar with, for example, the New York Constitution. So so there was very little writing on a blank slate. Whenever they were sitting around talking about, okay, so we need to have a provision on freedom of speech. Who wants to write that? Well, I'm from New York and we had a pretty good one. Why don't we start with that? Okay, that sounds great. Let's do that.
I see.
So there was a lot of plagiarism or cribbing or copying or however you want to put it. That's probably why it only took them 6 weeks.
And then after that, of course, the Constitution's ratified, the state enters the Union. What kinds of records do we have of that process today?
The good news is the delegates were pretty organized. One of the first things they did was they delegated somebody to be their scribe, and they authorized the payment of, I think it was like a couple $100 in gold dust to somebody to print up the debates that were handwritten. So the original 1849 California Constitution is written in longhand, probably on a sheepskin or a parchment or something like that. It's amazing. Like somebody sat there and had to, write with I don't know what they used back then, quill pens or whatever. It's kind of amazing. So we have the complete record of the complete debates, or at least everything that the scribe wrote down. I'm sure there was lots of, I don't know, side chatter that didn't get recorded.
But did they have like committee reports or discussions back then?
They did use committees, but I don't think that they were reported. At least I've never seen or heard of records of them. All we have is the committee of the whole and reports from the subcommittees to the committee of the whole. Okay, and then we move along a few years, and like many states often do, they have this in a dynamic process. They have another constitution. Why did they feel they had to write it again? The 1849 Constitution was not well regarded, and I don't mean to disparage the guys who wrote it, but it didn't turn out super well, and a lot of that was due to the evolution of events that were sort of out of their control, and they couldn't necessarily foreseen. So you have a state that undergoes explosive growth in every way, population, economically. Major industries start forming. The railroads, in particular, exploded into the dominant industry in the country, not just in California at the time. So in the 56. So in about 30 years over the course of 30 years from the 1849 Constitution, as you get into the 1870s, a number of things are going on. One is that the railroads have come to dominate not just the economy, but politics in California. It's fairly well known that starting from around the 1860s, 1870s, and going up until the Progressive era in the early 1900s, the railroads basically ran California to the point of having the legislature in their pockets. So that was happening. The state exploded in population and the economy exploded. There was a massive wave of immigration, a lot of it driven by the railroads, which were very labor hungry. Like building a railroad is a very labor intensive, literally labor intensive operation. So you had huge numbers of immigrants, both from the United States and outside the United States, from Asia and China in particular. And the third big thing that happened that was the impetus for the 1878 convention was that the economy crashed. So if you say to an American, the Depression, they'll probably think of the 1930s. But any economist will tell you that there have been a number of crashes. And if you talk to somebody that you ran into on the street in the late 1800s and you asked them about the Depression, they'll talk about the 1870s, which at the time was the Long Depression. So Great Depression, Great Recession, Long Depression.
I once heard someone's grandmother maybe it was someone who is now a grandmother whose grandmother, and she would refer to it as the real Great Depression. Right. It's sometime after the Great Depression that we understand.
Right. Yeah. So there was a massive market crash in the early 1870s, and so there was this period of great economic upheaval. So a lot of the the context of the 1878 convention in California was economic. It was driven by the dominance by the railroads of the main industry in California. It was driven by labor conflicts between sort of pre-existing or indigenous Californians and immigrants, both from other parts of the United States and then also outside the United States. And then overhanging all of that was this massive economic crisis, the biggest one that anybody had seen in their lifetime at the time. Little did they know it was going to get worse. So that's what led to it.
And then how did that all come together with what they came up with?
So it's interesting comparing the two conventions because I think the context sort of explains why they look so different. California was trying to get admitted as a state in 1849. Things seemed simpler back then. They probably were simpler back then. So when you read the debates in 1849, there's this you can almost sort of see a fellow with twirling his waxed mustachios saying, well, I concur with the comments of my colleague, the gentleman from South Carolina. It has that very, sort of old-timey flavor to it. The 1878 convention is completely different. The 1849 convention took 6 weeks. The 1878 convention took 5 months. The 1849 convention debates are about 500 pages long. The 1878 debates are 1,500 pages long.
Wow.
So they're very different. The character of the debates is also very different. So whereas 1849, it was very hail fellow, well met, and there was a lot of backslapping, and it almost seemed like very jocular, just a bunch of fellas hanging out writing a constitution. No big deal. 1878 convention, lots of strife, lots of fighting, not very collegial. They fought constantly. So they're things were more complicated. The context had a lot more strife in it. The delegates to the convention, there were more of them. They were not as collegial. So, so there are a lot of factors that contribute to the convention taking much longer, being much more fraught, and the debates being much longer.
And were there divisions within the delegates? Say there were some that were on the side of the railroads and some that weren't, or some that especially were maybe Chinese immigration, and some that were on the other side. Were there those factions, and how did those factions play out?
Yeah, there's one of the other ways of looking at and comparing and contrasting the two sets of debates is that again in 1849 they dealt with things at a much more macro level, and they did it in a more collegial way. So somebody would say, so what about slavery? Are we going to get admitted as a slave state or a free state? And everybody would sort of say, well, I think slavery is really bad. Let's move for admission as a free state. All right, that sounds really good. Moving on. It took like 5 minutes. What about community property? Women should be entitled to have their property upon a divorce. Yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that. Okay, moving on. In 1878, as you mentioned, it was much more factional. So you did have people that were sort of the representatives of the interests of the big industries like the railroads primarily. The one group that the 1878 debates are perhaps best known for are the working men. So one of the flashpoints for the labor strife in California at the time was San Francisco, which had at times pitched battles in the streets between members of what was called the Working Men's Party, which was formed by a guy named Dennis Kearney, between them and immigrant laborers, again, primarily Asian, and among them primarily Chinese. So the Working Men's Party were pre-existing Californians. I don't want to call them native Californians, but they had been there already. And they, it was straight protectionism. They were opposed to immigration. They were opposed to what they perceived as immigrants taking their jobs. And so that was the motivation of the Working Men's Party in San Francisco. And then members of the Working Men's Party went to the convention specifically on the platform of excluding foreign labor, particularly Asians, particularly Chinese.
Now, one thing that some listeners and fans of IJ might be wondering in listening to this is, I know there were there was some litigation at the time around this period, both before and after this convention, about protecting the rights of the Chinese laborers in California under at least the United States Constitution. I don't know about the former California Constitution. And of course, famously, after the convention, there's the case of Yikwo v. Hopkins, which protected, at least as the ruling was, protected the rights of the Chinese. Was the convention in some ways ruling against what the courts had been doing, or were the courts in a sense at that time in kind of in lockstep with this anti-immigrant feeling?
The way I remember those cases going is that you're right, but you have the timing backwards.
I see.
So the working men were successful in the 1878 Constitution in getting what at the time was Article 19. I think it was titled like the Chinese something. I actually can't remember the title. But it specifically referred to Chinese. So Article 19 had very broad provisions that expressly applied to Chinese laborers and, quote, Mongolians or Mongoloids. I forget which way they put it. But it was also much broader. It was specifically targeted, but broad enough to cover basically anybody that would compete with them for work. So that made it into the California Constitution of 1879. That then led to the litigation that you're thinking of. It also, on kind of a parallel track, it led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which Congress passed, which then caused some litigation and later got overturned. But there was an extensive series of judicial decisions, both then and they still sort of trickle in occasionally. California Supreme Court not that long ago reversed an earlier case from around this time that had denied a Chinese man, I think, admission to the bar as a lawyer, specifically because of these racially discriminatory laws. And somebody pointed that out, and the California Supreme Court unanimously overturned the precedent. Wow,
it can take a long time to fix a mistake when it comes to the courts. So this second convention, if someone is going to study what happened there, what kinds of records have survived from that period?
Well, that's the bad news.
Well, let's turn to that then.
So Steve, I know you've looked at both the 1849 debates and the 1878 debates. What would you say is the top level difference between the two of them?
Well, the 1879 debates are quite long, quite difficult to read. I mean, they are publicly available, but it's very, very small print. And as a practitioner, it really limits their utility. If you can't search through them, if you can't quickly find things, if it's difficult to decipher exactly what's going on, it's hard to develop a record if you're trying to advance or study a particular interpretation of a constitutional provision. So that's really the big picture difference. The 1849 convention records are shorter. They're actually easier to read, but they're of sort of somewhat lesser utility depending on which provision you're trying to study.
Sure. Yeah, there's a huge practical difference between the two of them because, so unfortunately, the 1879 Constitution being the currently operative one, that's the one that you're more likely to have to look at in terms of reading its debates.
Right.
There are reasons and times when you have to go back to 1849, but most of the time you're going to be looking at the 1879 Constitution, which means that you have to look at the 1,500 pages of debates. And as Steve said, so when they originally got printed in a physical book, I imagine it being like kind of a Shakespearean folio size. Like it's not an airport paperback book that fits in your hand. Like they were really big format. So when they got scanned by Google Books, they had to condense it down to a standard PDF size, 8.5 by 11. So it makes the print incredibly small.
Yeah.
It's really hard to use.
And it's just not, the way Google did it is just not searchable, you said, or not very well?
Well, I don't know, Steve, like tell me how much success you've had. Like I have a very hard time doing it, and I get very unreliable results because the print quality wasn't particularly good. The scan quality wasn't particularly good. And because the print size is so small, it winds up making it very difficult for the OCR software to actually tell one word for another. So I have no confidence in the word search results that I get from using the PDFs of the 1878 debates. What's it like for you, Steve?
I've had a very similar experience, and you're sort of left to a scattershot effort to search through and sort out what's in the documents. They're not sort of organized in a way that a modern, textbook or modern resource would be. So you've basically got to do word searches through a massive PDF and hope that the scan is accurate enough, or that you've got an accurate cross-reference from an existing document. I mean, if, for example,
did they make an index at the time, or did they just put it out there?
No, it's indexed, but it's terrible. Oh. and also, and this is my 21st century bias, it's not hyperlinked. So there's an index, but it's a very limited utility.
Right. So someone, has a case at the California Supreme Court or California Superior Court, and they're making a constitutional argument. The text has been there since 1879, and they dig into this resource to try to persuade the justices of their interpretation. What else is there out there to help them other than having to flip through this behemoth that you're talking about?
I think the short answer is nothing, Steve, unless you can think of something, Steve, like in terms of secondary finding aids. I can't think of anything. Occasionally you'll get lucky and a provision has been litigated before, so there might be a case on it floating around, or an academic has written an article about it. But that's not super likely, because if it's already been litigated, then why are you litigating it?
Right.
If it's a settled question, then why are we even here? The bad news is there really isn't much else. If you have to go back to the original text, that's really the only thing there is, and it's very difficult to work with. The flip side of that, though, I mean, it's kind of a good news, bad news thing, is that when there is debate evidence, and Steve, in a second I'll ask you about how you employ it. So when we were getting ready for this podcast, we did some quick research on how frequently and how the California Supreme Court uses evidence from the debates. And when we looked at it, I guess this is good news for practitioners. If you can find something in the debates that supports your argument, it's going to be very compelling. The California Supreme Court only rarely rejects or discounts evidence from the debates. So if you find it, or if it exists and you can find it, and it's on point and it helps you, it can probably be very helpful. So, Steve, what's been your experience actually trying to deploy that evidence in real life litigation?
I think it can be incredibly powerful because courts, and particularly state courts under the canons of construction, are going to look at the sort of original public meaning or the intent of the drafters, and the best way to get there is with the original source material. And for some provisions, we've got a pretty good record. I mean, you take free speech, for example. Obviously, there's the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and then on the state constitutional side, in 1849, the California Constitution drew the free speech provision from the 1846 New York Constitution. It was then incorporated into 1879, and then we have a very clear record of sort of what that means. Now, if you're litigating the right to fish or water rights, you may have a more difficult time piecing together precisely what the different constitutional directives and the intent was at the time, and meshing that with modern life in California.
I guess we should qualify what we both just said with the point that you wanted to make, Steve, about the fact that in California, you're not just limited to the 1849 and the 1878 debates. There's a whole other category of information that's potentially relevant.
Sure. I think Professor Carrillo highlighted the dynamism of the state constitution. On the federal side, we sort of have a constitution twice born of revolution, where you have these two significant inflection points in sort of 1787 convention and the 1789 Constitution, and then with the Reconstruction amendments, where you're looking at these periods of time either in 1789 or the late 1860s to really drill into what intent is. And those are the big sort of pieces on the federal side. On the California side, in addition to 1849 and 1879, the progressive amendments in the 19-teens mark sort of a sea change in Californians' relationship with their constitution, particularly with the introduction of the initiative process. And over the last, 100 plus years, we have the serial amendment of the Constitution through either direct initiatives or legislatively referred constitutional amendments. So just as one counterpoint to the long lineage of California's free speech provision, for example, we're now doing some research into California's constitutional right to privacy, which was adopted by legislative constitution amendment and initiative in the early 1970s. So then we're sort of going back into time to 1972, to the late 1960s, and what you look at there are the ballot arguments and sort of the context in which the right to privacy becomes enshrined in the state constitution. So in that respect, you're always sort of looking at a snapshot in time to determine the intent of the voters, in the intent of the California people.
Fascinating. So if someone is litigating, that provision or a provision from a different period of time, what does it seem the courts look to when we're talking about a constitutional amendment? Because of course you have the plain text of the amendment, you have what the voter maybe read on the ballot, which I know is often litigated to death, is what actually is the the introduction on the ballot where the voter is reading it and then has the text that they're actually going to be voting on. And then, of course, there's what was said at the time in the media, in the campaign for the amendment, with the signature process of getting it on the ballot. And what I find fascinating about this is because we talk about constitutional conventions and how constitutions are ratified and how legislation is ratified. Here the people directly are speaking on the ballot. Whether they're engaged or not is a different question. But getting at what they were thinking is going to be a big question there. So what generally have the courts looked to when they're trying to divine the intent of the voters and when the Constitution's amendment?
Steve, my impression is that particularly for more recent things, the ballot arguments are 95% of what will matter. Like as you go back in time, contemporary news accounts, editorials, things like that can be, I've seen courts consider those as secondary evidence of intent. But that tends to be older cases. For more modern issues, tell me what you think. My experience is that it really is limited to the ballot arguments.
Yeah, the California Supreme Court has been consistent in focusing on the ballot arguments. I mean, the language of the provision itself and the ballot arguments and sort of the surrounding constitutional provisions when trying to derive intent, and sort of depending on the nature of the constitutional change, the extent to which the court relies on the actual ballot arguments ebbs and flows. I mean, again, to go back to the example of privacy, that's an initiative that literally added 2 words to the California Constitution. It was the words "and privacy." So to determine what having, the inalienable right to privacy means, you've got to turn to the ballot arguments and get a feel for what was in front of the voters and try to get into the mind of Californians in 1972.
What do you think are the most maybe underutilized sources if someone's going to study or litigate about the California Constitution that they might not realize? I mean, I think most people, when they know a bit about state constitutions, know that there may have been a transcript of what was said at the convention, certainly something better for many states than what James Madison took in 1787, the notes he took at the convention. Right. But what else is out there that people might not know about?
I don't think that there really are equivalents to. Like the best example of what you're talking about on the federal side is the Federalist Papers.
Right.
it's a set of basically like pamphlets or news op-ed pieces that a few guys wrote and publicized. And because of who those people were and the role they played in actually drafting the Constitution, it's valuable evidence of what they were thinking. As far as I know, I don't think there's anything like that for either of the California constitutional conventions. And there's I can't think of anything that would be an equivalent for any of the big ballot propositions that we've looked at. And on the flip side of that, as we were just discussing, like particularly as you move forward in time, courts are less likely or less willing to look at anything other than the ballot arguments. And the reason they're more likely to do it as you go back in time is because the ballot arguments were non-standardized. California has this very particular way of doing them, and they've done it very consistently for the last 30, 40, 50 years. But if you go back to an initiative that was on the ballot in 1920, just finding the ballot arguments is difficult. Back then, there were only a few newspapers, and elections were conducted by proclamation. Like the Secretary of State would go out and basically nail a piece of paper to the nearest tree and send it out to the big newspapers. And the newspapers would run a special edition or put it on the front page. And so the whole front page of the San Francisco Call, which was a big paper at the time, would be proclamation. There's going to be election next Tuesday. We're voting on amending the Constitution to institute a right to fish or whatever it was. So first of all, you have to go back and you have to track down the October 27th, 1920 edition of the San Francisco Call in a newspaper archive. And then you have to see if there's anything else. So that kind of thing, it exists, and I've seen courts use it. I've used it in my scholarship, but only for older things. When you get to more modern things, like Steve, for anything after 1950, have you seen a court reference anything outside the ballot arguments for an initiative amendment?
Not off the top of my head.
I can't think of one either. And there's obvious reasons for that. That the court. I don't want to get into it, an originalism debate, but Steve talked a minute ago about how California courts, in general, their interpretive methodology is to start with the text, see if they can figure out what that means, and only if they can't figure out what that means do they go to secondary indicia of intent. And the gold standard for that, particularly for modern initiative amendments, is the ballot arguments. And I can't think of an instance where I've ever seen a court go outside the ballot arguments.
And you mentioned originalism. I think it's interesting. This isn't 100% true, but that in state constitutions, it seems like it's a lot less controversial when they're trying to figure out like what the original meaning, what the original intent of the various provisions it. Maybe that's just because it's usually not as much of a hot button contentious issue at the state level. Maybe it's because they're not as old. So it's the original meaning, right, of 1787 is going to be more shifted than 1920 from the present time. But it seems like there is a broad consensus in different states amongst Supreme Courts that it is very useful to look at convention materials. There isn't that much argument about it, although you always have the same different agreements you have on constitutional interpretation. Yeah.
Everybody agrees that the debates are relevant, but people might disagree reasonably about what they mean exactly. You're certainly right about that for California. When we were getting ready for this, we quickly looked for instances that we could find of the California Supreme Court looking at either 1849 or 1878 debates, and we found a lot of them. What we thought was interesting was that there were only rare instances where the court disagreed about what they meant. We found just a few instances where the majority would go one way and then the dissent would have an extra 20 pages worth of quotations and analysis from evidence from the debates to argue why the majority opinion was wrong. It was very rare. And so that was really interesting. I think for two reasons. One is that, as you said, it has long been the accepted interpretation methodology on the California Supreme Court that we look at the text first, and only if that's unclear, then we look at secondary indicia. And the things that are permissible as secondary indicia, it's a fairly limited set, like the debates, like the ballot arguments. So you have this very well-accepted, non-controversial interpretation methodology. And then the practical effect that you see is that tends to encourage consensus. We only found rare instances where the court disagreed over what that evidence meant. Now, there are some, when they disagreed, it tends to be fairly dramatic. Like Steve mentioned, we're working on privacy. And our position that we're going to take in this article that we're submitting for publication in a week or so is that the court initially got it right when it interpreted the ballot arguments for privacy and then changed its mind about what it meant and got it wrong. And it's been wrong ever since. So that next gets to your point that, like two reasonable people could look at the same piece of debate text and get completely different meanings out of it.
Absolutely. Which
then makes you wonder how much value originalism has, and you start chasing your tail.
Well, we'll leave that debate for another day.
Yes, please.
But what I'd like to close by, we've talked about California. We've also talked about most of what you guys do is centered on California, but sometimes you go a bit beyond that. Is from your experience of studying the California Constitution, for the other 49 states, whose constitutions and records and histories, of course, are all over the place. There's states that had a constitution many years ago, didn't really have a transcript of the convention. They just put it out there, and that's it. There are states such as Georgia that has had like 10 constitutions.
12. And 12.
Yeah, 12 is your count? Yeah, I know counts differ, but they have all kinds of documents you could look at for how that Constitution came together many times. What lessons could people in other states take for how best to first access the records that may or may not be online for how to interpret their Constitution, and then how to piece that together when they're making an argument or they're just doing scholarship?
I see those as two different things. On the litigation side, if I were in Steve's shoes, I might approach it from the perspective we did in the research that I just mentioned, where we looked at what the courts actually look at. Now, I guess you could think, well, if there's this other nugget of evidence out there and the courts haven't been looking at it, maybe that's how I win my case. I'm the first one who brings this new undiscovered arc of truth, and it's going to blow people's minds. That maybe, or it could be that that's just not in the category of things that courts are going to look at. So you'll get the reaction, okay, well, that's interesting, but we don't care about that. So I would look at it from the reverse end of the telescope. What is a court going to think is important from a practical side? If I'm a litigator, as an academic, I would look at it through the short end of the telescope and say, okay, what's the available universe of information out there? And then the secondary question is, what's the utility of it? So if I find one isolated letter to the editor in a newspaper in San Diego that published once in 1850, that's not going to be very persuasive to anybody. I mean, it might be academically interesting, but that's a very limited utility to make an argument for how we should interpret the California Constitution of 1849 because of this one guy one time in San Diego who wasn't even at the convention.
Steve, any thoughts as a litigator?
Yeah, as a litigator, I think in any of these instances, you need to develop the constitutional pedigree of whatever provision you're looking at to be able to inform the court and illuminate for the court precisely what it means. Again, to turn back to the free speech provision, you can trace California's free speech provision, back to the New York Constitution of 1846, through our constitutions of 1849 and 1879, and then through the modern development of free speech doctrine. And while California's Constitution is, as the Supreme Court will say, a document of independent force and effect that has protections that extend broader and are more protective of certain individual rights than, for example, the federal First Amendment. You've got an entire universe of material out there to sort of say, all right, this is what the provision protects. This is what it doesn't protect. This is how people throughout time have understood the scope and reach of a particular constitutional provision. So, if you're in Louisiana or Georgia and they've had 12 conventions, then you can trace your particular issue back in time, through each state's admission to the union and get a feel for exactly what that state constitutional provision means. And on that point, I think that's what's great about this project that we've got going on with the California Constitution debates, to get them scanned and more accessible and more usable for practitioners so they can go through and develop precisely this pedigree that can be quite powerful and useful in litigation and in scholarship.
Yeah, it sounds like you're going to solve the OCR problem for us. I
hope so.
During your current work.
I hope so.
That'd be great. Well, anything you guys would like to add about all things California and constitutions for our listeners?
Steve, do you want to go first and make a meta point?
I think the meta point for me as a litigator, again, is to go back, develop constitutional pedigree, and get to the original public meaning of each provision.
Well put.
I think the message that I'd want to get out there is that state constitutions have, they've always been there. They've been there since the founding. We had 13 states before we had a United States. But unfortunately, interest in or deployment of state constitutions has waxed and waned over time. The Civil War is maybe the best example of a time when state constitutions were very important. And that's been true or not true to greater or lesser degrees, throughout the nation's history. Even though I think that's sad, it still makes me happy that there are times when people remember that they have state constitutions and reach for them in time of need, and they will always be there for you. The whole point of having state constitutions and a federal constitution is dual sovereignty is the better protector of liberty. So when you're oppressed by one sovereign, you can turn to the other. And that perhaps explains why state constitutions wax and wane. Sometimes you need them to protect you against the federal government, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's the other way around. You might need the federal government to protect you against your state. That's happened too. I would just say, remember that you do have a state constitution, and if it has a provision that tracks or is a corollary or analog to something in the federal constitution, you may not want to make the federal constitutional argument first. There may be good reasons to make the state constitutional argument first. That may actually be better for you, and it may be better for state constitutionalism in general. So remember that you have a state constitution.
Well, David, I think that is beautifully put. As we like to say at IJ, you have two ways to win. Right. When your state or local government is oppressing you, and it's important that we all remember that. Well, thank you both for coming on Short Circuit. It's been a wonderful conversation about California and state constitutions. And I hope that in the future, we will have more episodes on engaging with state constitutions. But for now, I would ask that all of you get engaged.